Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're going to look at knitting abbreviations, specifically for decrease stitches. We're going to learn how to decipher all of those odd abbreviations, SKP, S2KP, KSP, there's lots of different ones, but they're really actually easy to decipher. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. But before we do that, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. And you can certainly gain confidence once you understand how to work all of those decreases and how those abbreviations work. First of all, let's look at a list of some abbreviations you might find in a knitting pattern. Some of these are common, some of them not so common. There's actually more than what's listed here. This isn't even all of them. But you see a list like this and your eyes start to cross a little because you don't know what half of that means. And every time you come to it in your pattern, you have to flip back to the abbreviations or the key and find out exactly what you're supposed to do. But it's actually really easy to decipher how each of these stitches are worked. The first thing you want to do is break things down into their abbreviations, each of these separate numbers and letters. Now the abbreviation for slip is often confusing because there are two ways to slip stitches, knitwise and purlwise, and this confuses a lot of knitters. But when it comes to decreases, you're almost always slipping knitwise because that puts the stitch in its finished position. We use a purlwise decrease when that stitch is going to be worked at a later time, and when it's finally knit, it'll be in its finished position. But in a decrease, we want to slip knitwise to get them in that position already. Now, there are some times where you're slipping purlwise in a decrease, but they're very, very rare. And you'll see when we work a few how that happens and why that happens. But the thing to remember is if you're slipping stitches in a decrease, it's going to be knitwise. Next we have K. K obviously means knit. Now with P, it could mean purl or it could mean pass. Most of the time in a decrease, it's going to mean pass. You're passing a stitch over another stitch. But if the first letter is a P, it's going to stand for purl. That's the only time in a decrease stitch. If you see a P at the beginning, it means purl, not pass. And along with pass, we also have PSSO, which means pass, slip, stitch over. And of course, there's TOG, which means together. And then, of course, there are numbers. 1, 2, 3. If you see a number in there, that's telling you how many stitches are involved in that step of the decrease. Once you understand what each of those abbreviations mean, you can start applying them to the decreases. For example, a knit two together, a K2 TOG. We just read it. It says knit, and there's a number after it, so it's telling us how many. And the other action involved is the TOG. Together, we're taking those two stitches, combining them into one, so we're knitting them together. It gets a little harder with something like an SSK, which is a slip, slip, knit, because that really doesn't tell us exactly what's happening. How are you supposed to slip those stitches? Knitwise, purlwise, but it really comes down to the action. Okay, so think about the action of an SSK. An SS, that means slip and slip. We're slipping them individually. If it said S2, then it probably means slip them together, but it says slip and then slip again. So the first thing is to think about how it's to be slipped, purlwise or knitwise. Most commonly used in decrease stitches, you slip knitwise. Because if you think about it, what would be the point of doing this? There's no point in just slipping purlwise, slipping them back and knitting them through the back legs. That would be kind of stupid to move them back and forth like that. So obviously, they have to be slipped knitwise. Insert as if you're going to knit and slip each one. And then from this position, they have to be knit together. So we have to move them back here. And while you're in that position, you knit them through the back legs. So why do we do that? Why don't we knit them through the front? We've changed the stitch mount. The leading leg of the stitch is now in the back, and we always knit through that leg of the stitch. It's back here now, so we need to knit them together back there. Now we're going to look at a few more decreases and how we can apply each of these abbreviations and figure out what's happening. Before we do that though, if you have any comments or questions, be sure to leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer them. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. So let's look at some of these decreases and how to read them. So our first decrease is an SKP. That means those letters mean slip, knit, and pass. So how does that look? We're going to slip a stitch. Remember, it's a decrease, so we are slipping it knitwise. We're going to K, that's knit a stitch. And then we're going to P, which is pass that stitch over the first stitch. and that KSP produces a left-leaning decrease. So if you happen to dislike SSKs, a KSP is a good option. Sometimes it's written out like this abbreviation, slip 1, knit 1, PSSO, or it can be called an SKP. So next we've got another one. This is a double decrease, the SK2P. So what's happening here? We have our S, that's telling us to slip, and we slip knitwise. K and a number after it, that's telling us how many stitches are involved in this step. We are K-ing 2, we are knitting 2 together. And then there's our P again, that's telling us to pass. So we're passing that first slipped stitch over. Usually you'll see the S and the P work together in a decrease because you're slipping a stitch and then you're going to later pass it over. You can see that's a double decrease. We took 3 stitches, we turned them into 1, and it slants off to the left as well. Now, here's an interesting one, the K2SP. So we still have that K2, the numbers coming directly after it, so that's telling us how many stitches are involved in that first step. We are knitting 2 stitches together. And now this is where it can be confusing, where that S means slipping a stitch purlwise. We've already worked this stitch. There's no reason to slip it knitwise again. So we're going to slide it right back. And now we have that P. Now we can pass a stitch over. This one right here. And that stitch is finished. There's nothing left to be done to it. We already have some yarn coming out of it, so we're going to slip it back over here. That's a double decrease. And this stitch ends up on top, so it leans off to the right. Now I know that one's confusing, but this is where you really have to think about what's happening. The K2 means knit 2. That slip, you have to think about it. What stitch is being slipped? It makes sense. This one has to go back to the left needle to have a stitch passed over and moved back. So it's an instance like that where you might see an S where you're slipping purlwise. This happens when it's a right-leaning decrease that has to be moved back and forth between the stitches. Now let's look at one more. The S2KP, or it's sometimes called the central double decrease. Now this one, there's an S, but there is a number after it. Now the difference between this and say an SSK, we have 2 S's side by side, which means those actions are done individually. But now we have an S with a number. So S2 is telling us we are working them together as one stitch. We're slipping them, and of course we're slipping knitwise, it's a decrease. So we slip 2 stitches. The next letter is a K, so that's telling us to knit the next stitch. And then we have our P, which means pass those stitches over. In this case, we're passing 2 stitches over. And that produces a decrease that doesn't slant. Oops, get both of them over. That doesn't slant to the right or the left. Instead, where it's called a central decrease, we can see that center stitch stays on the top. That's really all there is to deciphering these knitting abbreviations for decreases. I know it's confusing, but you really need to stop and think about each step. Think about what's happening on your needles, why they should be slipped knitwise instead of purlwise, and the few times they are slipped purlwise instead. All you need to do is break down each abbreviation and work each step of the process. And the more often you do that, the easier it is to understand what's happening, and you won't ever have to refer to those abbreviation lists again because you'll know exactly how to work those stitches. If you need more help reading your stitches, check out the free guide. I've linked it down below and you can see a picture of it right here. This will help you understand how your stitches work, how they should sit on your needles, and what they should look like when you're trying to count them. Leave me a comment if you have any questions about how decreased stitches are worked. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.